Go for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.
Hey, thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. It is TC and Friends Monday Night Musings. I'm going to tell you right up front, folks, I don't know how tonight's show is going to go, not because of my guest. David, by the way, is going to be joining us here shortly. He's getting all set up in his studio. But I got hit with a case of food poisoning yesterday that came on faster than Joe Biden shooting down a balloon, trying to cover up all the tragedies he's got going on in his life right now. So, yeah, that's probably a really bad political joke, but that's where we're at these days, folks. So all we can do is laugh, because if you don't laugh at what's going on in the world around us, you're going to cry. So, no, I'm not real sure that I believe that all of these random now UFO sightings are completely legit and could be meant to distract us from, I don't know, East Palestine, Ohio, or I don't know, the fact that it's been confirmed that we blew up Nord Stream, which, by the way, I just want to remind everybody, TC told you all about that. The same day that Nord Stream blew up, I told you that we did it. So, at the risk of being a cliched podcast host, I told you so. But before we get going, make sure you're checking out the merchandise, and head over to my friend Christy's website, and I'll put it in the link of this video just because. But remember that if you buy one of her books, I will give you a $5. What did I say? $5 credit towards any of towards any of my merchandise, to include this wonderful coffee. And this is right up my my guest alley tonight. This is the Minnesota Black Robe Regiment Muhlenberg roast, and because my guest has a show called History Rebels. Oh, thanks. Randy West said there was another train crash in Houston today as well. Yep, that's 3 now in the last couple of weeks. So, yeah, it's 3 train crashes in a week and a half or something like that. So, but yeah, so anyway, check out the merch. Go over to Christy's website, because her stuff is all about it's historical fiction. It takes place just prior to the start of the American War for Independence. She has fictionalized accounts of lives of people who stood up to King George's tyranny. And then, of course, the coffee. More History Rebels for you there. And you can find me at mbrrpodcast@yahoo.com. I should probably put my little streamer up there. And you can also head over to my Subscribe Star. And if you want to support another rebel of history, that'd be me. I'm just stroking David's ego before he comes in here. And once you start listening to his show, by the way, you're going to probably not listen to me anymore, because he actually has a producer and a sound guy, and he does like dramatizations. I just come on here and rant and pick on people. Now, this could be a very interesting conversation, because I listened to the first few episodes of his podcast, and we've already had a conversation about the topic of his first few podcasts. And I think it'll be fun, not hostile by any stretch of the imagination, but we do take that topic in level of importance very seriously, but come at it from slightly different perspectives. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring David in here. Dave, do you prefer Dave or David?
David.
All right. Well, David, thanks for coming in and doing this. And relatively short notice, once we actually started talking about it and got it scheduled, you were Johnny on the spot to say, sure, I can do that. So So tell us a little bit about yourself, and my apologies to anybody who likes him because he's from Minnesota. You're gonna have to deal with two Minnesotans on one show.
Yeah, luckily my Minnesotan accent isn't too strong. um but yeah, a little bit about me. My name's David. Like you said, I'm a fellow Minnesotan. I'm a big podcaster. I like listening to podcasts, mostly history podcasts. I always like to be learning something. And then I have a show of my own, as you mentioned. It's called To Be a Rebel. So I explore the lives of rebels throughout history, do so in a storytelling way, try to put the reader right where these rebellious figures were, um, just to kind of give a little bit of context for who I cover. So, like, my first series was on John Brown, abolitionist, leading up to the Civil War times. I just got done doing Ida Wells. My next one is actually going to be on a more recent person named Lolly Softsai. But we can get into that more. But yeah, I love rebels. I feel like when you look at them in a historical context, you really see the necessity of them and being able to speak out. Um, and yeah, that's basically more about me.
So you go by podcast fanatic on the Twitter sphere. Uh, you must have a lot of time to listen to a lot of things.
Yeah, luckily, my job right now, I can listen to music and podcasts all day. So, and I don't know, I just feel like it's a good way to learn. Like sometimes you switch it up, you listen to music, but it's like if you can listen to something, you might as well be learning something.
Yeah, I spend probably the first half to almost three quarters of my work day listening to lectures and podcasts, and I listen to Tom Woods and the Libertarian Institute, whatever they have on there, especially Scott Horton stuff. I mean, I listen to a broad range of things, and and then about the last half of my day, I try to listen to either some sort of fiction audio book. I do a lot of my reading that way, or believe it or not, I actually listen to um, real tabletop Dungeons and Dragons type role playing games as they're recorded. There's quite a few of them out there that are really interesting, and very good storytellers there, which is encouraging. A lot of them come from a far different perspective than I do ideologically and philosophically, but they are great storytellers. So, and that's one of the things I enjoyed about your the start of your series with John Brown was the storytelling and the dramatization that went into it, and the fact that you're doing a lot of the scripting and recording and whatnot on your own, and so it makes me ask, you have a researcher that you work with to do a lot of your stuff. How did that happen?
So I usually get like a different researcher for each series. Some of them I just do on my own if I'm not able to get anyone. But for John Brown, Dr. Paul Burrow, he actually used to be a pastor at my parents' church, but he also has a degree in history as well. And he happened to be pretty well researched in the Civil War era leading up to it. So he knew quite a bit about John Brown because he studied him during like seminary too. He had came up a few different times. Um, but I think like for most of the research that I've gotten so far, there were a couple people that I met on Twitter, which is kind of cool, because like sometimes like you would never think that you'd meet someone who would like help you in that kind of way on the internet, but you can always make community. So yeah, I've met three people so far who have given me research for my podcast from Twitter, and then that I knew in person.
Well, you definitely would love to connect with my friend Christy. She's very, very much into research, and you guys should reach out to one another because I think it would make a great. She's starting a podcast with a co-host that she helped run for office in her neck of the woods in Arizona, and they're going to be talking about history and politics and the impact on culture and society, and it'd be a great crossover for you guys, for you to go talk to her because she's a phenomenal writer. Her books are great. So
I'd be down. You said that she does historical fiction, right?
Yeah, yeah. So she's
Sweet.
working her way through the American War for Independence right now. So it's a
Okay.
good book, right up there. Liberty and Death. Oh, the fatal stamp. So
It's a nice cover too.
yeah, it's yeah. I I'd probably hand draw my own cover in my book when I'm finished, and it'll look like a 4-year-old drew it because that's
Those
my
little stick figures.
little stick figures. Yeah. So so let's dive in a little bit to your research. And I know there again you had this, pastor of your parents' former church or former pastor of your parents' church do a lot of that for you, but you put a lot of that together yourself as well. You kind of scripted it out for yourself and took that research, made it your own in how you presented it, and you kind of walked away from the topic of John Brown, lauding him a bit as a hero, um, in the sense of his antics and shenanigans were very much in keeping with being a rebel in history, but you saw a lot of what he did as being heroic. And I take a little bit of a different tact on that. Give us a kind of the nutshell version of your view on John Brown and what he did.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, I think where I stand with John Brown, I generally say that his actions were heroic. Basically, I think that in a sense he accelerated the coming of the Civil War. Um, I think ultimately, for what it's worth, I believe that the Civil War was required to end slavery. And so, with that being established, I think that it was good that he brought it on sooner rather than later. And I think that his actions contributed to accelerating it because with the raid on Harper's Ferry and the way that the media covered it during that time and the legacy that he left behind in the couple years after, it's kind of weird because like in a way it almost kind of caused more division, which sucks, but I guess you kind of go back to the point of like it had to happen one way or the other. But I do see other sides of it too, and I know that you mentioned it earlier. We actually had a really good discussion about this, and I feel like that's what history is about: is like looking at the evidence and then seeing how one person may look at it and seeing how another person may look at it. Because history is never perfect; it's never crystal clear. You know, you have to discuss these kinds of things.
Well, and as we've learned that, yeah, history technically, the winners of every conflict write history, but we also see in hindsight and now in contemporary sight as well, we do see that sometimes history can be rewritten by people who have an agenda, and that's been one of those things is there. I've had to look back on a lot of people that I would have considered um, somewhat, kind of ideological heroes of mine, especially when I was much younger. And David, I don't know how old you are, but I know I'm much older than you are. But when I was, a kid, Abraham Lincoln was a huge hero of mine. I bought into the idea that Lincoln was the savior of the republic, that he was this, this wonderful uh, philanthropic man who all he cared about was his fellow human beings. But in my perspective, when you step back and you look at our country being a constitutional republic, you look at the historicity of the right of states to have the power over the centralized federal government, a very Jeffersonian view of history and of the republic. Lincoln was actually a tyrannical monster because he did things that if we did them today would be considered egregiously immoral, if not murderous, in the unleashing of the federal troops on the South, the northern troops on the South, and how they were unleashed, and the fact that he paved, and historically, I believe he paved the way for the erosion of the republic as it
He set a
stood.
precedent for it.
Yeah, absolutely. because of the things that he did, like rushing in and having an entire body of legislators arrested and held without due process, and because they were, for lack of better terminology, in the eyes of the North, they were rebels. But when
Sure.
you look back to his predecessor Buchanan, Buchanan disagreed with secession. He didn't believe that the states should be, or that they even really had a constitutional right explicitly stated. He believed that they did have that Ninth Amendment ability to separate themselves from what they believed to be overreach by the central government. And so Buchanan said, "All right, if you guys want to secede, I'm not going to do anything. I don't believe I have the authority constitutionally or even morally or ethically to, crack down on you." And I think that's also something, and you know this from doing research. A lot of people think that secession happened when Lincoln took office. It was like, oh, Lincoln's president, there's this looming war. All of a sudden, these states all got together and said, we don't like Lincoln, and we're going to, keep slavery legal in our states, and we're done. And actually, the states had pretty much started the ball rolling on secession well before Lincoln ever gotten into office, and Buchanan didn't stand in the way, which, if you're thinking as a modern American, in strictly that sense, you're like, wow, that's really bad move on Buchanan's part. Lincoln did the right thing. And I'm sitting here saying, I really don't know that we are better off for having had that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I feel like when you look at it in that historical context, like it's really easy to argue that he did set the precedent for trampling states' rights. But it's kind of funny too because when you mentioned that, it made me think about like modern context too, and like nowadays, like the Constitution is like consistently trampled upon, and it like now obviously it's way worse than back then, but but nowadays it makes you think too, like who's the rebels now compared to like who they said the rebels were back then. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, you look today, moms that show up to school board meetings and dads that show up to school board meetings and people that show up to town council and city council and county commission meetings, and they speak out and they name somebody, on the council or whatever on the board by name. They're immediately have their mics cut off and then are escorted out. I'm like, this friend of mine, her name's Terry. She's up in kind of west central area of the state, and she literally was physically escorted out of the building by a captain from the sheriff's office of the county she lives in, because she had the audacity to name in frustration people on the county commission who she believed were doing things wrong and weren't doing what they were voted into office to do, and they got rid of her. They just kicked her out.
Yeah, Minnesota law enforcement, man,
Oh, don't
they
get
got some
me. Don't
issues.
no, don't open that door.
Dude, I was just gonna say I should run an episode on you. I guess you could be considered a rebel.
No, I wasn't asking for that, but if you want to, you let me know. I'll anything to get the story out
We'll
there.
do a 3-part series for you.
Compare in the end, coming to the conclusion that I'm just like John Brown.
Yeah. The Minnesota John Brown.
No, please, let's not get that out there. Well, let's go to your idea of or your conclusion, I should say. After doing research, that slavery really had to end in and I don't want people to have the misconception that I support chattel slavery in North America. I've never been in support of it. I just believe that it could have gone the way of slavery in Great Britain and in continental Europe in much the same way. It could have gone the same way here, I think. Maybe taken a little bit longer. The South they were definitely dragging their feet, but my opinion, they were modernizing, they were industrial, They were experiencing the same kind of industrial revolution that the North went through before they did. I think it was coming. Chattel slavery was a horrible scar and stain on the history of the Republic. Um, Nothing's ever going to change that. Nothing's ever going to make it go away. Nothing's ever going to pay. There's no amount of money or uh, apology that can be made. In fact, the people who are guilty of it, I can't apologize for them. But I also believe that having the bloody battles where literally more Americans died in that particular conflict for something that I am convinced would have gone the way of the dodo bird eventually in the United States, to me is a great and maybe almost equal evil, and really paved the way for um, escalated and um, increasing tensions between the varied ethnicities within the continental United States. I think that it actually caused more racial tension. I don't even like using that word race because I don't believe that we're different races. We're different nations of people, ethnic. Uh, I believe that it actually caused a further division and propagated that division well past what it would have been if the end of slavery would have come around peacefully.
Yeah, so I would say, like, as far as my conclusion goes, there's a few reasons why I feel like it wouldn't have died out on its own without like an intervention. I think first off, when you look at the lynchings that occurred even after slavery, for at least a few decades, they started dying out a little bit more towards the 1920s and 30s because more states started passing anti-lynching laws. Granted, it is a little bit different than slavery, but that would kind of indicate to me the sentiment of where the South for sure lied. But the other thing to keep in mind too is that some of those lynchings actually did occur in the North. Not as many, granted. Everything has to be put into context. Um, I think another thing to put into context too, though, is that even with a lawful intervention, is that the law can't change people's hearts, And I would say that churches probably played one of the largest roles in, I guess, what you would say reversing slavery and helping people end it. Um, but as far as their efforts to bring it to an end, that was a little bit complicated too because there were some white church leaders that were starting to come on board with it, but a lot weren't. So I would say that their efforts were kind of thwarted a lot too. Um, I know you mentioned the economy of the South, starting to show signs of becoming more industrial. What signs would you say those were?
Well, they were starting to realize that there were better mechanisms for even dealing with their cotton crops, and a lot of advances had been made agriculturally there. And slavery was actually already dying in the South at this time. And then I think another aspect of slavery in the South that we've kind of bought into historically is this idea that it was rampant, that everybody had a slave in the South, and that there were just slaves on every farm and every homestead and on every property in
I
the
think less than
South.
1% of Southerners own slaves, I believe.
Yeah, it was. No, there again, 1% of evil is evil. It was
Mhm.
it. But when you ask the average person, slavery was in their eyes was everywhere. You couldn't walk down the street without running into a slave master who was beating his slaves. And there again, that did happen. There were definitely, horrible slave masters, slave owners, and but they're also slave holders who had inherited their slaves, and many of them set their slaves free. Many of them set their slaves to the north so they would not be, captured and resold to others. Many of them had freed their slaves, and their slaves chose to stay on as paid field hands. Now, obviously, some of that is conditioning. They didn't know any different in life. They couldn't. A lot of them couldn't read, write, didn't have money to go out and start things. But slavery, there again, as evil as it wasn't as rampant as everybody says it was, and it wasn't supported by as many people in the South as everybody thinks. The vast majority of people who were fighting on the side of the Confederacy were not fighting to protect slavery. Many of them were fighting to
Wasn't
protect.
General Robert E. Lee? He was against slavery, I
Yeah,
believe.
he was against slavery, and actually up until Lincoln was fully prepared to stay in the Northern Army, to stay in the Union Army. It was only after Lincoln and a lot of the aggressions that started to show that Robert E. Lee said, "I will not take up arms against my Southern brothers."
Right.
And
He's the one who got John Brown too.
yeah, yeah.
Ironically enough.
But even looking at that, because you made a really good point that John Brown came from a very, I think it was he a Presbyterian?
Calvinist.
Right, but I couldn't. Was he a Presbyterian Calvinist or a Baptist Calvinistic Baptist?
I want to say Calvinist Baptist, I believe, but I'm not 100% sure.
So was Robert E. Lee was Calvinist, and so was Stonewall Jackson.
Basically Calvinist means that they believe in the sovereignty
theology
of Bible over man, right?
Well, it's an emphasis on the sovereignty of God, and so they were Robert E. Lee, John Brown, Stonewall Jackson, many others in the South were actually Calvinists, and a lot of them were against slavery. And ironically, a lot of the people in the North were not Calvinist and very aggressive. So, so Brown, definitely had a right and proper view of mankind, in that all men are equal, and that God does not look on the outward appearance of a human being to determine their worth. So that was definitely a good motivator. I just believe his conclusion that it was okay to kill people, to kidnap and murder people, and let's just be honest, if that had been a Southerner doing that to the North, that's how it would have been painted. It would have been painted as these evil men were raiding the South, or coming from the South, raiding the North, and murdering people. And that's what John Brown did. He raided and murdered, towns and homesteads. Well, he didn't murder the homesteads. That was a stupid.
He kidnapped George Washington's nephew, or great nephew, I think it was, and got Marquis Lafayette's pistol, I think it was, and then a sword.
Was it his pistol or his sword? That was, or both.
Yeah, because I think it was Marquis Lafayette's pistol, and then a sword from Frederick the Great.
Yeah, there you go. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I brought up, I think that an even greater evil in the world today is abortion. I think abortion is a phenomenally evil act. Yet I would never advocate for violence being done to end abortion. And we're all against that, right? I mean, we hear about abortion clinic bombings and we lose our minds, because nobody should ever want that. We should never want people, even if we are adamantly opposed to what they're doing, we should never want those people murdered to prevent them from murdering. And we all agree on that. Well, not all. There are some fanatics out there, but
no, I feel you. I mean, as far as abortion goes, I'm kind of really just on the fence about it, Like, I don't know if there's a way to say I'm neutral, but I'm as neutral as possible.
Well, I don't believe that. One, I don't believe the federal state should be in charge of making those decisions. I believe that the Supreme Court ruling on abortion was was right, that it did need to be turned back to the states. I'm adamantly opposed to codifying it or amending it into any state constitution. I don't think anybody
Aren't
has
they?
a
Are they gonna? They did that in Minnesota, didn't they?
Minnesota codified it. Yeah, it's codified
Dang,
in
man,
Minnesota, like
that's balls
into the
for
most
you.
egregious and extreme ways. And
Jeez.
but I mean that's Minnesota for you right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that being said, I like you said earlier, you're never going to change a person's mind with the law. You may get some subservience, you might get some obedience, but you're never going to change a person's thought process on something by legislating it in, into or out of morality. And I think that's one of the great weaknesses of the modern American, but especially the modern American church, as you look at it in the involvement of the American church in the history of the republic. The American church has become incredibly weak, and I don't mean like as strong as John Brown kind of strength. I mean just incredibly weak in its political uh, will and its political ways, and even weak when it comes to expressing views that the rest of society might look at them and say, "Oh, well, that's weird or that's uncomfortable. Why would you feel that?"
Would you say that for like all denominations across the board, or is there any like one in particular?
I think denominationally, it's weakness. Are there individual local churches that maybe do take a good stand? Sure. But then there are also individual local churches like the Westboro Baptist, which is a cult. It's an incredibly egregious cult that I'm like, I wish you'd shut up and stop saying you speak for Christians. But I say that too about a lot of the churches that don't want to offend anybody or are more interested in protecting their. This is my buddy Chad Catter is who's watching. He's going to like this. They're more interested in their 501c3 protections than they are in actually standing for what's right against what's wrong. Because boy, we got to protect that tax exempt status so that people can write off their charitable giving to the church. And so, once again, imagine that the overarching strength of the state has stepped in. And even though the First Amendment says they'll make no law about religion or the free practice thereof, they get you to sign on that dotted line when it comes to that 501c3, and they got you by the short hairs. Well, not in your case, on the chin. So, but yeah, I mean, the church used to. Christianity, encompassing Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism and whatnot. The church used to be the place, especially in Western Europe and North America, where you could go and look for the rebels.
Yeah, Martin Luther. Oh, that's a good point too, because I'm actually going to be covering Martin Luther. We'll be doing a series on him because I would definitely consider him to be a rebel too. I still have a little bit more of research to do on him, but like I remember even growing up because I grew up Lutheran, and they talked about him all the time and how, he kind of led like the reforms because like prior to that, like the church had a lot of like bad things going on. So
Yeah,
there's a good example right there.
historically, there's a lot about him that's worth looking to and saying, "Wow, this is a guy that we could all take some advice from." But there's also a lot of things like just from a Christian perspective, from which actually I think comes from the fact that he was discriminated against in a very harsh and horrible way. Um, there were a lot of seminaries he would have probably been far better off in that he couldn't get into because of the way laws were written at the time. That had he been allowed to go into, a lot of his views on Christology and others would have been a far more firm by all definitions of what small o orthodoxy and within Christianity is. He was actually not Christian because he denied some very key aspects of the divinity of Christ and whatnot, but he still led a great movement towards reform in the United States that I think is worth applauding and doing it in a non-violent way.
Did he start? Wait, you said that in the U.S., but like in Europe too, though, right?
As far as
like the reform efforts and like the good impacts that they had.
Well, I think a lot of what he stood for did lead a charge across the globe. A lot of people at that time were able to notice him in ways too that he was he was on the cusp of modernization of media. It there were times where you could see him doing what he was doing live, and it was easier for people to become aware of him because of the propagation of mass media, in
Wait,
a
are we
way.
talking about Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King?
Oh, I was thinking of King. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, that's why I was confused when you said the U.S. because I was talking about Martin
You
Luther.
were Oh, you were thinking of. I thought you added King at the end of that. So
No, yeah, because you were mentioning how you could find a lot of rebels at churches. So Martin Luther being, I feel like he was a good example of that.
well, yeah, he was. Yeah. Well, they tried to kill
I'm
him.
glad we clarified
Yeah.
that.
Uh, yeah. So let's go back. I was talking about Martin Luther King Jr., not Martin Luther, the theologian and reformer of the Catholic Church. So
Mm.
yeah. So yeah, he was a great reformer, and I also think Martin Luther King Jr. Was also a great reformer of the American uh, system. Just his theology was bad. So there, two rebels of history. Thanks for asking, because I really thought you were talking about Martin Luther King Jr.
No, yeah, I figured because you said you can find rebels in churches because I've heard that before too. Like there's a lot of people that use religion in a good way to bring about change, and obviously Martin Luther was one of those.
Yeah, for sure.
Are you
And
Lutheran, by the way?
I was raised Lutheran, but I'm actually a Calvinistic Baptist without a home right now.
I thought
So
you were gonna say without any association to John Brown.
yeah, yeah, well, definitely without any association to John Brown. Um, but I struggle, finding a place, a church, that I can fit into now, because a lot of the things that I say fly in the face of more conservative churches and their perspective, as far as kind of the worship of the state is. And I hate to use that word, but it is almost, Christians, ironically, are almost as worshipful of the state as they are of God. And that's from both churches that lean to the left and churches that lean to the right, to the more conservative side. And it's a really weird thing, because I can get Christians from both perspectives that'll come against me and um, just rail on me, because they don't know what to make of me. I have had the great distinction in the last month of being able to um, get conservatives and leftists to defend the cops at the same time on the same video.
That's
Now,
hilarious.
talk about. I don't know if anybody here is a fan of the original Ghostbusters, where they talk about dogs and cats living together. It's mass chaos. That's what I've accomplished. I've got the dogs and cats to live together in mass chaos, and they do not know how to respond to me. And especially with Christians who frequently quote things like Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, and tell me, oh, we're supposed to obey the ruling authorities. And when you challenge them on that, they're like, you're a rebel. I'm like,
You're like, what's wrong with that?
so tell me a little bit about, since we talked to philosophy on John Brown and the war of northern aggression. Um, when you look through history and you look at all of these people that you're thinking about talking about, I know you've listed people like Joan of Arc. You're going to do some work on her. Of all the people that you're thinking about covering in your series, and their kind of ascendancy to rebel status, who do you think has been most pivotal so far that you've looked at and had the most far-reaching impact?
Good question. So done Ida Wells, John Brown. And that's actually a really good question because it's also calling into question, unfortunately, how rebels usually don't win, you know?
Hmm.
Um
But don't you think, David, that we defining winning, we often make the mistake of thinking that the rebel wins when the rebel completely overthrows whatever they're fighting against and then becomes, the leader or whatnot. Um, and sometimes when we look at rebels throughout history, many of them did lose that the fight that they were directly, involved in, but end up sparking a larger movement that has sweeping uh, power, where it goes in and changes the face of history in stronger, more fundamental ways. You look at the French Revolution, which was not anything like the American War for Independence at all. It was a complete overthrow of the moral structure, complete overthrow of societal structure, complete overthrow of the legal structure, of the religious structure, and they won. They absolutely won, but they destroyed the face of Europe, especially the region around France for decades. And it took somebody with despotic designs like Napoleon to come in and correct that. And that, look at how bloody that was in that correction. Whereas you look at a man like Gandhi, who was definitely a rebel, who lost. I mean, he lost in the grand scheme of things, but he sparked a broader, more far-reaching and longer-lived revolution than many others in history. And
You did a really good job of describing that, and now I know exactly who I think is most impactful. I would say my upcoming series on William Wallace, because
wonderful, yeah.
even though he was publicly executed in a very horrific way, by the way, um, he helped inspire a new generation of Scottish to eventually defeat the British and gain their independence. Like I think it was 15 or 20 years after his death. But
The
in
guy
many
who
ways,
turned
he
on him actually became the leader of the revolution that he started.
yeah, John Balliol, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But in a lot of ways, historians point to his victory at Stirling Bridge as being kind of like a turning point in rallying the troops. I mean, again, it's kind of indirect ways, but ultimately, if it weren't for him, I think it would have probably taken longer for sure. So I would say he had a pretty wide impact on Scotland. And I mean, you think about it too, not just their independence, but his status in general. I mean, he's a hero there, like a lore. And the funny thing is too is like that's one thing I ran into when I was reading and doing research on him, is trying to separate fact from fiction. I mean, part of it is because it was so long ago, and
So
Scotland
much
didn't
mythology,
maintain.
yeah.
And no, yeah, Scotland didn't maintain written records as well as England did. But yeah, he had a very wide like he is upheld as a hero there. So I had to definitely separate that.
Well, and you brought up, now that we had it established, you brought up Martin Luther, the German priest who became, the as much as he didn't want it, became the founder of the Lutheranism. And when you look on the grand scheme of things, he ended up with a church that was named after him. People didn't really honor his wishes. He didn't want it to be known as Lutheranism, but he just wanted it to get back to the purity of Scripture and less about these established man-made traditions. And in the grand scheme of things, when you look at it, it doesn't really look like he won. But in the my Roman Catholic friends don't like him at all. Uh, they've consigned him to the deepest, darkest parts of hell, and of course he did the same with the popes himself. But that's not uncommon in a rebel. What you'll see oftentimes with rebels throughout history is the person that they are fighting against, or the person who does the most harm to them, really does kind of become the very incarnation of Satan to that person. And I speak from my personal experience that I have several people on my top five who, there's probably like 15 people all tied for the top five worst people I've met in my life over the last 3 years. Um, we do tend to, reserve these scathing dialectics towards people who are um, on the very far end of whatever fight we're on, and have determined that they're beyond hope, beyond salvation, beyond redemption, or whatever you'll call it. But Luther was ostracized, and he lost a lot, lost friends and family. There were wars started around that, and he even spent a large amount of time hiding and in obscurity. But the ramifications of what he did led to the French Reformation, the Swiss Reformation, and the Scottish Reformation, the English Reformation, and even up into Northern Europe. And I think for the good, because a lot of those people then went on to fight slavery. And like William Wilberforce was an English Calvinist who really sparked the abolition of slavery in Great Britain with his fight, along with John Newton.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to rebels, sacrifice, it's a really strong theme in it, Like some of them, not only did they lose their physical lives, but their reputation too. And sometimes they're redeemed over time, but not always.
Yeah, I'm my own showrunner, so I'll get people that message over here in the message bar, and then I get people that message me on Twitter when they're watching. And so I'm like,
Hopefully
I'm
they're
listening.
saying cool things about me. I'm just kidding.
Well, everybody always likes my guests more than they like me. So, um, so you bring up William Wallace. Uh, do you see rebels in modern America now that like you could think of by name, or do you see modern American rebels more as a ideological philosophical position?
I definitely see it as more ideological and philosophical because like it's hard for me to actually look up to someone and say that like they're a hero or like they're a good rebel like all around. And I guess part of it could be that nowadays we just tend to scrutinize people more, it kind of seems. Cuz I mean, although I'll say this, one person that I am 100% admire for being a rebel is Ron Paul. He was probably the greatest quote unquote rebel of all time.
Well,
Um,
let's delve into that. What makes Ron Paul, of all the people in modern American politics now, what makes him a rebel? When we have people like the Squad, AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who I'm sure people would like to say, oh, they're rebels. But what sets Ron Paul apart in your mind?
what makes him a rebel in my mind is that he is very unordinary, but in a good way in his policies, like being non-interventionist. Because nowadays a lot of people associate like non-interventionism as like a bad thing, and they want more government spending. He was against that, and he butted sides actually with the conservative Republican side as well, just as the left side for wanting to cut spending on like the military. Um, very pro freedom, which again, like that, even that's been really iffy on the conservative side, as you know.
Oh,
So
the not even the conservatives, but just the GOP in general. They hate left-wing authoritarianism, but they love their own right-wing authoritarianism. So
Yeah.
they're dead set against, CRT, which we should all be dead set against CRT being mandated in state run schools.
Do you think it
Whether
would be okay as a voluntary course?
Sure, as long as you weren't forcing somebody to take it.
That's
Yeah.
understandable.
But um, it, you look around and you watch the right, and I don't even like calling them the right, but I coined the phrase with my friend Walter Hudson. I'm sure you know who Walter is if you're from Minnesota. He's all over Twitter. He's probably one of the more libertarian leaning conservative voices in the Minnesota
I don't think I've
House.
heard of him. I should add him though.
Yeah, you should find him. You should definitely find him. Um, here's this guy who's clearly not white, um, advocating for very traditional, very constitutional, very much American Republic type values, and is against the idea that we should be mandating morality, but does take a measured approach to legality. And he's in my eyes, my friend Walter is a rebel because he doesn't fit in at all with the norm in Minnesota, and fights a kind of against both things. But there are people in the Republican Party who want to legislate the crap out of everything, and they call that freedom. And I'm like, that's not freedom, like, at all.
Yeah, one thing I was really disappointed with, and I'll tie this back into the rebel concept in a second here. One thing that I was really disappointed with the GOP, I guess, especially in Minnesota, is that they kind of a lot of them
You just
went
have to say
along.
GOP in Minnesota, and that sparks all kinds of disappointment for most.
Is I would have liked to a lot of I seen a lot of them go with the left on saying that the vaccine mandates were okay. And I would have liked to see more of a pushback against that. And how I'm tying this back in with rebels is that it's really interesting because like nowadays I would see people who, refuse to get the jab for a job. I would see them as a rebel. And it's kind of weird cuz like you would have never thought that that would be a thing, but here we are.
Yeah, well, uh, after leaving my uh, former career field, I had people that I worked with that reached out to me and were saying, "Oh crap, the sheriff's office, Olmsted County, is making everybody get the jab. What do we do?" And I'm like, "Say no." I mean, if that many of you are really against this, you have to say no because they're not going to get rid of all of you.
Right. There's power in numbers.
Yeah, they're. I mean, if if only 30% of the staff at the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office had all said no to the jab, and they put them all out on disciplinary leave to try and coerce them into taking it, they wouldn't have been able to do the job. 'Cause
Although to be fair, who knows if that would have worked because they got rid of a lot of nurses and doctors even when they didn't. And then they
right,
tried to bring in the military to help run the hospitals.
right, and that didn't work either. So I mean, it's kind of, you look at. I think what we're about to see happen here in Minnesota, something for you to keep an eye on since you like to talk about rebels. The home education movement here in Minnesota, I think, is on the cusp of becoming a very broad, rebellious movement, if you want to use that term, because of the legislation that's going through the House and the Senate right now, where they're going to start making homeschool families report more often and basically get curriculum approval from the school district to be able to home educate. And if they refuse, there are legal penalties for them.
Yeah,
And
that's wrong. I think I've seen something about that too. And I'm definitely keeping an eye on it because I don't have any kids right now, but I plan to, at some point over the next few years. And me and my girlfriend have talked about it before. Like, we would like to homeschool. It sucks that Minnesota is so like strict with that because I've heard that like Wisconsin, it's a lot more lenient. They don't try to like force a curriculum down and all that kind of stuff.
well, and that's the big thing here in Minnesota is that while other states are going a little bit more towards liberty. There's a huge fund the student, not the school movement here in the States right now, and it's really taking a hold in a lot of places.
Mhm.
Um, it's interesting to watch and I've seen this happen over and over and over again in Minnesota and other places, is that we see legislation coming towards us, and we show up to committee hearings, we testify because we're friends with somebody who's in the House or in the Senate, and we speak out against whatever the legislation is because we're dead set against it. But then it passes into law. The governor sign, it passes, the governor signs it, it becomes law, it becomes active, and then now because it's law, we feel obligated to obey it. And my answer to that is if you disagree with it that fundamentally that you're willing to go out there and speak out against it, then disobey that law.
Civil
When it,
disobedience.
yeah, and be willing to suffer the consequences for it. But then also build a network of other people who are willing to uh, disobey with you, so you defend each other.
I think I'm all for that. I think the biggest issue that we face nowadays is that technology has kind of like weakened us because it's easier to just keep chilling and playing video games, watching movies instead of
Recording
actually
podcasts.
instead of like showing up to these meetings and getting shit done.
I think one of the great things is seeing homeschool families show up to school board meetings.
Yeah, and
I,
speaking of that, isn't it crazy to think that like they're considered rebels now? Something that's used to be like more traditional. Homeschooling was like the traditional thing, and now it's like an act of rebellion.
well, when you look at the inception of the government or the state-run schools, it was always meant to uh, cause disintegration in the family and in the social fabric, and really were always intended to be centers of indoctrination to inculcate children with thoughts of statism. And
To make them workers, not thinkers.
right, absolutely, 100% true. And I don't think I'm going to be doing a little short series, probably 1, 2, maybe 3 episodes on the rise of industrialization in the United States, and as it preceded the rise of state-run, state-mandated centers of indoctrination, because schools operate the way factories do.
Exactly.
Same amount of days. You have bells that let you know when it's time for a break, let you know when it's time to switch stations.
The
And,
concept was invented by I believe it was Rockefeller, and I think there's a famous quote by him about it, about how he was just looking to train workers, and thinkers aren't good for companies in the bottom line.
and and so I think what you saw was homeschooling was always seen as pushback, but it was always very quiet. And then it started to gain momentum, both on the left and the right. There is a left wing version of homeschooling where it's very much, hippie culture and whatnot. And there's, the kind of this right wing. And now they're being kind of forced into becoming, you know, political bedfellows. And that's what they say, politics makes strange bedfellows, that they're now becoming kind of political bedfellows and really having to work together to be able to maintain that liberty to fight for the freedom of their children from statist indoctrination. And I think, to me, that's the most heroic of movements out there right now, is the home education movement, greater than Black Lives Matter and all of the others, is because it does encompass
Better
such
than
a
Antifa.
well, Antifa, they're not rebels. They are spokesmen for the regimist. So,
George Soros.
um, have you always been into the rebels of history, or is this something that, when you kind of found yourself becoming more politically awakened, did you find yourself then going, wow, where have rebels played an important role in the United States?
Funnily enough, excuse me, funnily enough, I think I always have been. I've always been a big history person too, because in high school I was always taking, the AP classes like AP US history. I was acing them. I remember there was one class in college where I used to fall asleep, but then the professor would ask a question and I would say the exact date as soon as I woke up. So I've always been good with history. And as far as rebels go, I've always been big into the rebel side of history too. And I think for me, it was kind of like a political philosophical thing because back in high school, I was I guess what you'd say pretty liberal, a bit of an anarchist lean in a sense. And then over the years, kind of went a little bit more neutral, tiny bit conservative on some issues. And it's kind of funny because I feel like all throughout time I've always been on like the rebel side of things because back in like '08, like I feel like the left was more of like the rebellious people, you know. And then now it's like the right's the more rebellious people. Um and I feel like my historical studies kind of reflect that too. I mean obviously the founding fathers being big rebels, I always like studying them. I feel like there's a big like story element to it too, like the underdog, you know. Everybody likes a good underdog story and that's a big part of rebel history.
When you look around the world and you break away from, say, Western Civ, since you're a big history guy, I was too. I didn't get. I got into college, but I didn't get through college. College kind of ran through me, so I was not prepared for college. I did not know how to study. I could, the classes I was good at in high school, I passed with A's and B's on a bad day. And the classes I was bad at, I scrimped out a C minus. I hate math, by the way. So uh, math and a lot of the sciences, because people lie to you and call science not math, and then you get to physics and chemistry and it's nothing but math. I'm like, that's not science, that's math. And they would get mad at me because I was a rebel. But when you get outside of Western Civ and you look around the world and the history of antiquity, do you see rebels that we could emulate today in antiquity and maybe even Eastern civilization that we could really learn from?
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned one earlier, Mahatma Gandhi is a pretty good one. Very nonviolent. Um, Ultimately paved the way for Indian independence from Britain. Um, Another non-Western one that I think we could learn from. I plan on covering Mulan, because she kind of was a rebel in more of like a gender and a class sense because Um, I'm still at the beginning of this, so my research is a little rusty, but from what I know so far, it seems like she rebelled against the gender norms, joining the army. And that was apparently based on a true story. I just thought it was a movie, and then someone told me it was a true story, and I was like, all right, I'm going to cover them on the podcast.
That just shows
So
how much difference there is in our age.
I'm 29, so um
Still a kid.
but I think maybe people could learn from Milan today. Oh, here's another one that people can learn from. I'm gonna be doing one on Malala Yousafzai. I don't know if the name rings a bell, but she was shot by the Taliban in 2012, I believe it was. In
Wasn't she the young lady that was a student?
Yep, the Taliban had banned education for women, and then she kept going, and they eventually put a bounty on her. They shot her on a bus, but she survived, luckily, and now she's like has a foundation. I'd say we could learn a lot of bravery from her because her and her dad. It's gonna be an interesting series. I think you'll like this one. Anyways,
I I like the John Brown one. Just because I push back doesn't mean I don't like it. I'm,
true.
I'm all good
Um,
with people being wrong.
yeah, I mean that's what history is about. You gotta discuss it, man. Not everyone sees it the same way. Um,
Do you have a historical quote from a rebel that you think of on a regular basis that sparks something in you?
yeah, there's one from John Brown, and it's a really simple one. It's just these men are all these men are all talk. What is needed is action. Action. And it's simple, but it just reminds me that like, yeah, sometimes you gotta draw the line, you know?
And
Um,
and I would echo his sentiment in that regard. I look around, and I've very recently on, um, especially over the last going on 3 years now, have noticed that there are a lot of men out there flapping their jaws about being against mandates, being against or being for medical freedom and whatnot. But then when it comes time to stand and actually show up at a protest, an actual protest, not just like a little get together at a city hall somewhere where somebody rented a room and they can all these like-minded people can all get in a room and say their little chants together, and but actually show up at a protest or say no to an employer and put their money where their mouth is. A lot of men today are cowards. They're just absolute cowards, and they really rely on politicians to do the work for them, and which is really how we end up screwed. Is we vote for the person who can get the votes because they promise to do things for us that we want done, and then they don't. But you watch across Minnesota, especially over the last 3 years, the most vocal people for the most part who stood up against the mandates, who stood up against uh, government overreach in Minnesota, especially, were women,
yeah. There was
and
one
very few men
guy.
to be found supporting them.
Yeah, there was one. I think he was a state rep. Eric Mortensen
Yeah, I'm
from
friends with
the.
Eric. I know Eric. So
Yeah, he's awesome. I would say that he's definitely he's a rebel, modern day rebel that we could look up to because I mean, he definitely stood fought back against the mandates, which I certainly appreciated. So
yeah, and I am not taking away from people like him or my friend Walt or others. I'm just meaning like people who are not in those political positions, who are elected to serve, but people who are actually out there who are their risking their livelihood. My you want to do a series on a rebel? You should check out my stuff on Lisa Hansen from Albert Lee. I mean, the gal went to jail for 90 days for keeping her coffee and wine bistro open in the city of Albert Lee. And it, like, did she win that fight in the grand scheme of things? No, she lost because she lost her business and she went to jail, and now she has a conviction on her record. But man, she won because she stood on her principles. She stood on the ideals and fundamentals of the backbone of this republic, and she inspired a lot of other people to start standing. And that's why it's touched my heart about her from the moment I met her in 2020. And I saw the same thing with Lisa Monet Zarza and Larvina McFarquhar and Jane from up there in Moorhead. Uh, it's just over and over and over again. It's been women putting their money where their mouth is, and a lot of men standing behind them, going, "We got your back, sister. Wait, we're way back, but we got you. You just keep fighting. We're going to keep going to work, but you do what you do." And um, and there are but there have been some guys that have led. Mark Bashofsky ran for Minnesota House of Representatives this year, or 2022. Man, it's 2023 already, and he gave up a career as a therapeutic, was it no respiratory therapist. Yeah, because he saw what was happening in the early days of the pandemic, and he fought against it. Him and a friend, and Mark started the Mask Off Minnesota movement. So, but it's been predominantly a women's led movement across the entire country, and you're right. These men are all talk. It's time to take action. So,
I wonder. I'd wager that a lot of the women were probably mothers too, because I feel like with the vaccine mandates too, like a big thing is like the school ones that they're trying to do. Because the mothers are at an age where they can see it, and obviously dads care about their children too. But I feel like that maternal instinct, especially with something where you're seeing the myocarditis come out in increasing frequency, I can see why they're very passionate about it, you know?
Oh, for sure. Um, and I think too that history has beat men down as well. You know, we lionize female figures in history. Sometimes we don't talk enough about them, but other times we make more out of them than what should be made out of them. And strong men throughout history are now, of course, attacked. Um, down with the patriarchy, and I'm like literally seeing a movement to try and get like people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and stuff just absolutely removed from history because they were patriarchal. And I'm like what? I don't under what? and and so men have just kind of been throughout history over the last 20 years, 20, 25 years especially, men have been kind of told, ironically, you need to know your place. you know and own the guilt that you own for being male. And so we almost don't want to we really a lot of times are afraid to look at a guy who's doing something that should be deemed heroic and say, oh, that's heroic, because you'll get the, oh yeah, but what about her over here doing this? Or we get told that heroic men are men like, Bruce Jenner, you know. Eh, So, well, there's a perfect example. They flat out, Caitlyn Jenner, as Bruce is now known, uh, has been labeled a hero for the actions that they took. There, how's that for political correctness? And
Great job.
and what do you think that the changing of the definition of like hero or heroic rebels or whatever? How do you think that's impacted the way we look at history when it comes to these heroic rebels in the past?
Well, it's definitely changed for sure. Because I feel like historically, how we would view a rebel is someone that resists authority, usually unjust authority, like tyrannical. Um, but nowadays, by mainstream views, a rebel would be, someone that stands up to the patriarchy, supports abortion, stuff like that. But and a lot of that, ironically, is actually in line with the state. So the
It's very
mainstream view,
mainstream. Yeah.
yeah. So like the mainstream view of a rebel nowadays is not against the state. So I would say sometimes maybe it is, but overall not like it used to be, which is weird because that's like the core of the definition of it. So it's
Well,
really weird that it's changed.
yeah, you look at how society now treats people who say no to the current agenda. Uh, Even though the agenda is mainstream, people that are saying no to the current agenda are now, they're not rebels, they're dangerous, they're terrorists, uh, it, they're marginalized in ways that we couldn't even begin to uh, try and push off on others. But then again, social media and mass media being what it is, it's very easy to control the narrative, ironically. Whereas before, in the days of like the American War for Independence or the days leading up to it, nobody really controlled, as much as they tried, they couldn't control the freedom of the press in the colonies, because everybody and their brother had a little printing shop in their basement. And I mean, it wasn't quite that widespread, but when they would shut down one printing press, another printing press would spring up in its place. And so it was very hard for them to control that. Whereas there is such a lock on who gets positive imagery in the media today. And when you do see somebody stand up, oftentimes the media points to them and says, look, don't be like this person. And I think we're. Do you think we're going to find ourselves in a place where we need these heroic rebels, and we're going to have a hard time finding them because nobody's going to be able to point to what a hero or a rebel is based on the old definition?
Yeah, I actually think that that's a fairly accurate assessment because, you know, unfortunately, like there aren't that many rebels nowadays because they just go with the mainstream and the true rebels get ostracized. It's kind of hard to say if there's going to be a tide going the other way at some point. It kind of harkens me back to like the discussion that Elon Musk has been brought into about like wokeism and like are we turning the tide on that? And I don't know, it's really hard to say because I feel like rebellion specifically is a part of human nature, but I just hope that it hasn't changed to the point where true rebellion can still exist, if that makes sense.
Well, I think as I look at it now, most people see true rebellion as this idea that it almost, for them, it means violence. To be a real rebel, it means you're violent, you're willing to do violence, and most rebels throughout history have been the most reticent to use violence, to use force to um, accomplish their means. The men who are considered the founding fathers of this nation, they never wanted to go to war with Great Britain. It was never their desire to go to war, ever. They like ironically fought against the idea of fighting for a very long time. They tried everything under the sun before they finally issued the Declaration of Independence. Gandhi, like you mentioned and we had both talked about, uh, Gandhi was a complete pacifist. He did not believe in violence in any way. But we don't hear anybody talk about Gandhi anymore at all. No one talks about the founding fathers anymore today, unless it's to disparage them. But then we turn around and we look to South Africa and we look at the ANC, the African National Conference. We look at Nelson Mandela, and everybody calls him this wonderful rebel and hero, but very, very little talk about him and his affiliation with violent extreme terrorism in South Africa and the fact that he orchestrated much of that. You can't point that out. And if you do, then it was justified because he was fighting against people that were doing the same thing. And so it's really hard, I think, today for people to really have a firm foundation for how they're going to define rebels in history without it coming down to their social agenda.
Yeah. Sorry, I had a thought on that and then I lost it.
That's because I didn't shut up.
um Totally lost that train of thought.
I probably kept you up past your bedtime. You're getting to be an old man.
Yeah, I have been going to bed increasingly early over the years, actually.
Oh, I mean, at the age of 29, what are you, in bed by midnight now?
Usually like 10.
What time do you get up in the morning?
Oh, like 5. I try to hit the gym before I go off to work because I drive like 40 minutes to work because I'm in Bloomington and then I work in Otsego near the Albertville outlet malls.
So all your 40 minutes is all in city driving.
What's that?
All of your 40-minute commute is in city driving.
Yeah, well, for the most part, because once I start getting to work, then I get kind of more towards like the rural parts,
Yeah,
like
I'm the opposite.
Rogers.
I'm the opposite way. I've got about a 40-minute drive. It would, it only takes me about 20 minutes to get to the edge of Rochester, but then it takes me about 20 minutes to get to where I'm going once I'm in Rochester. So, but um, how long? We'll wrap this up so you can get to bed, old man. Um, How far do you see taking this? Do you think you're going to run out of subject matter, or do you think the more you dig, the more you'll find?
No, I think that I'm always gonna have fodder for this. Because the thing is, like, and I actually this was gonna be my train of thought before you just reminded it to me now.
All right, well then go with it.
So when it comes to rebels, there's more than just political rebels too. There's also like spiritual rebels. There's also even musical rebels. Like I would consider Jimi Hendrix to be a musical rebel, or like again, this is something I need to do more research on, but like, the person who invented rock and roll, I would consider them a rebel because at the time people said that that was like the devil's music, and now
There are
everyone
still morons out there saying that, by the way.
and now everyone loves it. So I feel like there's always going to be rebels to cover. I mean, throughout history, like I've barely started to get outside of the West. I mean, there's still a lot of rebels that I need to cover in Asia. I need to do a lot on the French Revolution. You reminded me of that too. And I'm willing to go a little bit more modern too, because for me, I would say history is anything probably like 10 years and past. So I mean, there's a lot to cover. I think I'm planning to do this for a really long time.
You heard that, folks? That means he's going to have a subscribe star or a Patreon within the next 6 months to a year and a half. Which you know you heard about him here first, folks.
This is the first show I was on before I made it big. No, I'm just kidding.
You'll be bigger than me in no time. Won't take much though. Um, when you talk about covering more modern day rebels, I would tell you, let's make sure that all of us are really looking to the modern rebels today, but not you know the radical societal types that really want to shift gender norms. And I'm not saying that every gender norm is great, but are out there pushing the envelope on those things. But the people who are not afraid, like my friend Lisa, and I have my friend Sarah's tuning in. I don't know, she must have just got here. She normally has commented 15 times in the first 10 minutes of the show. Yeah, I said it, Sarah. But you look to like Sarah and her friends down in Owatonna. They are rebels in their school district because they have really come in across the board and fought against the inculcation of CRT in their school district, to the point where the local papers really tried to paint them out to be these radical, dissident, dangerous, hardcore. I mean, some of the things that were said about these folks, and I'm watching them, and these are just people that care about their kids, who are showing up to school board meetings to have an impact, to make a change. And they're brave. They're just absolutely brave in the face of great social pressure and being ostracized. And their group encompasses a group of people that were all fired for refusing the mandates at their job. And nobody talks about them anymore, because it's not like you were saying, it's not the approved state line. So it's a very, very dangerous place that we find ourselves at. True heroes, true rebels today. And I even equate those terms. True rebels today are like they were years ago. Oh, they're criminal. They're dangerous. They have to be silenced. They need to be shut down. While we, glorify and lionize these over here, because these voices are the voices we support.
Yeah, it's weird times we're living in, man.
Yeah, you should. That'd be a great thing for your series, to just have every few episodes find a modern here or a modern rebel, especially here in the United States, that doesn't meet the politically correct definition of what a hero is today, or a rebel is today.
Yeah, it's a good idea too, because one thing I do want to cover like in my podcast is like lesser known people as well, to kind of shine a light on them because like, the saying history gets written by the victors, and I feel like especially in the modern day with anyone who does go against the mainstream, whether they're just like censored or even just not heard as much or suppressed like through social media algorithms. So I mean, it's like they're there. So I'd love to tell their stories.
You look at Brett Weingartner, um, Dark Horse podcast. He and his wife were professors at Evergreen State out in Washington, and they're not right wingers by any stretch of the imagination, but they stood up to the Gramscian Marxist revolution that was taking place at the university or at Evergreen State, and were literally hunted. In one case, Brett was hunted off of the campus. They were looking for him. They were going to do violence and violate him because he wasn't throwing himself on the mercy of the Marxist struggle squads of the day. And I mean, the guy's a hero. And I say the same thing. I ideologically, or not ideologically, philosophically, in the exact opposite camp of James Lindsay. He's an avowed atheist, and I am not. But that guy's a rebel today. I don't know if you know who he is, but
I think I've heard of him.
He's an absolute modern day rebel out there pushing against the narrative of the state and of acceptable culture. And he's actually making inroads. And he's making inroads because they're trying to cancel him off of every platform he shows up at. And we're even seeing that in the movement, like the walkaway movement. I have a good friend that was part of the inception of the walkaway movement. His name is Mikey Harlow. And it was him and one other guy that really kind of sparked the walkaway movement of open homosexuals, lesbians and gays, who had had enough of being kind of railroaded into a leftist ideology and the direction it was going, and they just walked the other direction and rebelled against that accepted perspective of what homosexuality meant, not just in the lifestyle, but in their philosophy, and just attacked. They're absolutely attacked for it. And I look at them and they're rebels. They're absolute rebels. And we can learn a lot from them. And that's why I really think I'm going to enjoy your show as it progresses. And I really want people to check it out, is because we're going to learn a lot more from the rebels of history than what we learned from the compliant, sheepish people of history. No one in history ever got famous for being compliant and sheepish. Ever.
That's a good point, and it kind of reminds me of a quote by a famous feminist that's like, "Seldom do women who behave make history." But I feel like, in a more general sense, that kind of alludes to what you were saying.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people who toe the line are the first ones that get taken down.
Well,
So where all can everybody find you? What are your socials and all of that? And how often is your show coming out?
yeah, so people can follow me on Twitter at the Pod Fanatic. My show is going to be coming out every week. I do 3-part series, so I usually break it up like beginning of their life to like adulthood, and then like adulthood, all the major events that they were like involved in, and then looking at like their last days and discussing the legacy that they left behind. So you can search for the show called To Be a Rebel wherever you get your podcast. It's available everywhere. Yeah, it's gonna be once a week, and it's gonna be going on for a long time. It's evergreen.
And it's definitely a storytelling format.
Yep, and I try to use sound design too. Try to put you right where the rebels were. You know, got to make it fun.
Could be trauma inducing for those of you that don't know what a horse sounds like. I everybody's used to quiet now. Nobody knows what real horsepower is. So, um, any other things in the works? Any other stuff that you're working on, or
Yeah, I also do write a newsletter where I shout out other history podcasts besides my own. Because I'm just a huge history buff. So in the newsletter,
in normal speak, that means you're a nerd.
yeah,
Okay, I just want to.
I'll wear the
I
I'll
am
take that
too.
label
I'm a nerd
proudly.
too. So
But yeah, so I write a newsletter every week. People can subscribe to that. If you're big into history podcasts, you'll definitely like the newsletter. I try to check out new shows every week. I especially try to feature indie podcast shows because I cannot stand some of like the corporate run shows that like Amazon has sponsored. But yeah, each week I talk about the best shows that I ran into, the best episodes. I also talk about what happened each day in history, and then I feature a little photograph that's related to the event and a guest recommendation from someone else of a history podcast that they listened to that week. Um, and for that, they can just hit the link in my bio on my Twitter, or it's historyweekly.eo.page/landing.
yeah,
Enter your email and subscribe.
nobody's gonna remember that. They're gonna have to go to your bio. In fact, though, you can actually send that link to me, and I'll add it to the description of the video.
Okay, sounds good.
Any closing thoughts for the audience?
No, I just wanted to say thanks for having me on. It was really interesting discussing the concept of rebellion. I always like discussing it because I feel like it's such an intricate part of human nature. And I also like being on your show because I feel like it was like a back and forth exchange and not just, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, I intentionally try to not agree with people. Just I'm a
Just to push the
contrarian.
envelope.
I'm a contrarian. I'll take the other side just to see what somebody else says sometimes. But
I mean, you get more out of people that way, though.
I've always told people, like, my show is conversational, not directional. So I don't have the following of Tim Pool, but gosh darn it, I wear the beanie better.
I feel that.
So, well, I really appreciate your time, and look forward to seeing you push this out so we can get more people interested in your show. And I look forward to seeing where it goes. And if there's ever anything else you need or anything else you want to talk about or discuss or push back on, you let me know.
Yeah, I'll definitely be hitting you up about some of those other people to cover on my show for sure.
Oh, I'm full of ideas. I just don't know if I'm full of action. So, well, I appreciate it. You go and get yourself ready for bed, old man.
All right, have a good night.
Take care. Ladies and gentlemen, that's David from To Be a Rebel. It's a great show. Seriously, the first few episodes are absolutely phenomenal, and it'll make you think. As I was listening to his 3-part series on John Brown, I was like, hey, some valid conversation to be had there. The thing that we have to do is we have to get out of our echo chambers and our comfort zones and start talking to people who maybe we have a lot in common with, but we don't necessarily agree with everything on. We learn more that way. We don't learn anything if we spend all of our time talking to people that we agree with. And if we find ourselves surrounded by people that we agree with 100% of the time, then we're either the bootlicker or we're surrounded by bootlickers. And I don't know about you, but I'm not that person. I don't want that kind of person in my life. I don't want people who agree with me 100% of the time. And I don't want to agree with somebody 100% of the time. I want people who are able to think, who are free thinkers, who are able to arrive at conclusions on their own without being told what the conclusion should be. And that's one of the greatest weaknesses of our society today. There aren't enough Davids out there in the world who are willing to look back on history and talk about people with accuracy and fairness and point out where they were right and where they were wrong. And, we had a little bit of confusion. I thought he was talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and he was talking about Martin Luther. But I'm going to point to Martin Luther King Jr. Was he a great man as far as social reform? Sure. We could learn a lot from how to promote social change from him, especially the aspect of nonviolence and peaceful resistance. What we see happening in our culture today is nothing more often than not is first verbal violence towards each other that then leads to physical violence and physical altercation and clashes. People out there who would consider themselves rebels like Antifa and Black Lives Matter are nothing but violent, dangerous dissidents who are hell-bent on destroying everything around them to make a point. But you look at a Rosa Parks. Who did Rosa Parks hurt? What was the violence in Rosa Parks' resistance? Where was the violence in all of the people who did sit-ins at lunch counters and places like that? There was no violence on their part. The violence was done to them by the state. True rebels in history, violence is their last resort. And normally when violence does arise, it's because violence is being done to them and they say, you are not going to push me around anymore. That is the greatness of the American Republic. That is the greatness of the republic, or the constitutional republic that we are. We have these steps and these processes, this process that we go through to voice our discontent with the way our people that should be our servants, elected and appointed servants, should be conducting themselves. And it's only when we are pushed into a corner that we have to come out swinging. I frequently use this statement or this analogy with a lot of people. We should always voice our discontent. When the other side draws a line, when the state draws a line and says you will not cross this line, and then you agree to not cross that line, then they draw that line a little further back, and they push you back, and they push you back, and they push you back, till eventually they have your back up against a wall, and you only have one option: fall to your knees and do everything that the state tells you to do, or they're going to push you to your knees and put a bullet in your head. We have to start being rebels now and refuse to back up when they draw the line and tell us that we'll go no further. In fact, we should be the ones. We should be the rebels drawing the line. You've come this far, but you'll go no further. And that's why I would love to see you guys all go over to the description of this video and follow David's podcast and listen to how the rebels, some of them I will agree with him on it being heroic rebels, and others maybe not. But we can learn from the rebels of history, especially those of us who cherish life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the preservation and the reclaiming of our republic. So, my friends, until next time, fight for your freedoms. They belong to you. Fight for your freedom. It is yours. And Sic Semper Tyrannis.
We are going for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at